Once again, everyone is welcome. As you already know from, if you attended our event throughout this month, we would like to observe a minute of silence in memory of our fallen colleague, Dr. Edward Nambigne. With the permission of the chair once again, shall we allow a minute or so before I introduce the chair and hand over proceedings to her. It is the Institute of African Studies seminar series in conjunction with Reading Decolonization in Africa Today. It's a key event, and we are here to, as the chair will elaborate on, celebrate the book, a book of one of our own. My job, as usual, is the easiest on the day, which is to introduce our chair for this event. Professor Nana Ekia Anyidoho is our, like I said, our distinguished chair for this event. She is associate professor at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, ISE, and the director of the Center for Social Policy, CSPS, both at the University of Ghana. She serves on the executive committee of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, CODESRIA, the board of directors of the African Studies Association, ASA, and the advisory board of the SSRC's Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa program. She is the immediate past president of the prestigious Ghana Studies Association, GSM. Since obtaining her PhD, she has carried out research, wide-ranging research with funding from the British Council, DFID, IDRC, MasterCard Foundation, Open Society Initiative of West Africa, and the World Bank. She was co-lead for UNECA's report, The Situational Analysis of Youth in Africa, which culminated in the development of a policy toolbox for African governments. Between 2016 and 2017, she was, Professor Nana Ekia Anyidoho was the lead consultant for the development of a social development strategy for Ghana's National Development Planning Commission, NDPC, as part of a long-term national development plan for the government of Ghana. Professor Nana Ekia Anyidoho, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mba. I know who has been on my website lately. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm so pleased to be here. Even though I don't sound like an African studies person, if you just look at the area that I'm in social policy, I do have a background in African studies from my graduate days. And as you heard, I am very involved with the African Studies Association. So I'm really pleased to be involved in any events that is held by IAS, and especially today's event, which I find exciting, talking about listening to, hearing more about, and discussing this fascinating book on travel and the Pan-African imagination. I've been told that we have 90 minutes in all for this event, and this is how we're going to organize it. We're going to first of all hear from the author, who's going to take up to 30 minutes to discuss the book that we're all here to hear more about. And then we are going to have 3 discussants take 10 minutes each to respond to the book. And then we are going to have about 25 minutes for audience participation. So that's how we're going to go about this event today. I'd like to introduce the author, to take his 30 minutes to talk about the book Travel and the Pan-African Imagination. The author is Tracy Flemming, who I believe now goes by Dr. Mankutam. He's a senior lecturer in African Studies in the Department of General Studies at the University of Environment and Sustainable Development in Somanya in Ghana. Prior to that, he was an associate executive editor of Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and coordinator of the program in African and African American Studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan in the US. In addition to this book that he's written, he has articles and book reviews in Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and the Journal of West African History. I'm very, very pleased to give the floor now to Dr. Mankutam to talk about his book. There is a synopsis of the book, which we should have received as part of the publicity for this event, but there's no point going over it when we're going to hear from the author himself what the book is about. So over to you. And welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Prof. I hope that everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my screen. I only have about 6 or 7 slides that I would like to share to accompany my talk. So first, I'd like to talk about the origin of this particular book. First, it can be traced to my youthful interest in Black history as I came of age in the Mississippi Delta in the American South. I grew up in a predominantly Black segregated town in which the legacy of in full display, perhaps most notably with a railroad track dividing white residents from Black residents. I remember being fascinated in secondary school with Black history factoids that occasionally emerged during my otherwise Eurocentric social studies classes, leading me to encounter the autobiography of Malcolm X, as well as Richard Wright's novel titled Native Son. During my undergraduate studies, I took every class that I could that focused on African American studies and African studies. It was during these years at a private, historically Black liberal arts college for men, Morehouse College, that I read Cheikh Anta Diop's The African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, as well as his Civilization or Barbarism, an authentic anthropology, in a world history class designed for history majors. My career trajectory then changed. Prior to reading Diop's work, and even as I was a history major, I was preparing to go to law school. But the influence of Diop's work on my already deep interest in Black studies convinced me at that time that studies of African and African American history was my professional calling. It was during a research-based class for undergraduate students that I encountered Edward Wilmot Blyton's collections of essays titled Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race in a library at a private historically white research university. It was also during my undergraduate studies at Morehouse College that I first conducted research on Denmark Vesey and African revolts against enslavement. Ironically, I first conducted research on Alexander Cromwell in an independent studies course that focused on African American women in the Department of History at Morehouse, particularly his writings on African American women in the South. In the same class and during discussions of Hegel's racist philosophy of history, I was encouraged to read the historian Wilson Jeremiah Moses's controversial book titled Afrotopia, The Roots of African American Popular History, as well as his monograph titled The Golden Age of Black Nationalism between 1850 and 1925. By the time I was admitted to a PhD program in history at the University of Michigan after my undergraduate studies, I was convinced that intellectual history would be the focus of my studies. This book is a revision of my PhD dissertation in intellectual history. After graduate studies, I became deeply interested in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to studies of African people. I found that Africology provided me with more creative ways to research and write about Africans and African-American intellectuals. I'd like to cover a few definitions to help guide the discussion that ensues. This definition comes from Molefi Kete Asante, a prominent Africologist, from his book titled Afrocentricity, the Theory of Social Change. He writes that, quote, Afrocentricity is a mode of thought and action in which the centrality of African interests, values, and perspectives predominate. In regards to theory, it is the placing of African people in the center in analysis of African phenomena. Thus, it is possible in terms of action and behavior. It is a devotion to the ideas that what is in the best interest of African consciousness is at the heart of ethical behavior. Finally, Afrocentricity seeks to enshrine the idea that Blackness itself is a trope of ethics. The next three definitions I would like to briefly cover come from Nana Itibari Mzulu, our ancestor journal, Africology. This is from his 2007 publication entitled Africology, A Concise Dictionary. The first definition of what an Africologist actually is. An Africologist is a scholar activist committed to the advancement of knowledge about the African world, one that believes in or follows the ideas and theory of Africology, one who studies various aspects of the African experience across continents and generations from an Afrocentric perspective. The second definition is of Africology itself. It is a term popularized by the late Winston Van Horn concerning the Afrocentric study of phenomena, events, ideas, and personalities related to Africa, and an area of academic inquiry concerning Africa and people of African descent, a normative and empirical inquiry into the history, life, and prospects of people of African origin throughout the world, the Afrocentric examination of phenomena related to African people that fuses academic content and institutional organization. And finally, the Africological paradigm.
Did we lose Dr. Mankutam?
It appears that we have for a bit. Let's see, is he still on the call?
No, it's gone. Maybe he will come back shortly.
Dropped off.
Okay.
Yes.
I think I left off with the Africological paradigm. So I'll pick up there again. Can you hear me and see the slides?
We can't see the. If put a little less pressure on your bandwidth.
Okay. I think this connection may be a bit more secure.
All right.
Apologies. We have connectivity or network issues in Somanya on a regular basis. I'll leave off with the last definition of the Africological paradigm. It's an African-centered approach that fosters intellectual stringency, moral clarity, rigor, and critique. It is a process or standard designed to recenter Africa, to reposition African people as subjects in the evolution and revolution of ideas and redirect human consciousness. So my book is about, number one, African and African-American men who were religious leaders on different sides of the Atlantic Ocean during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Two, their theoretical contributions to the emergence of the academic discipline of Black studies in the second half of the 20th century. And 3, the significance of Africology in the 20th and 21st centuries. The book aims to explore the impact of Black religious intellectuals on the emergence of the political movement that came to be known as modern Pan-Africanism, which is, according to Professor Zulu from his concise dictionary, it is a theory of political ideology concerning the unity of African people around the world, an international socialist and anti-imperialist ideology that recognizes the unity of African people everywhere. The first religious figure was known as Denmark Vesey. He is credited with helping to organize what many scholars believe would have been one of the largest African revolts against American enslavement in 1822. Vesey was a leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He remains a controversial figure in history due to his advocacy of armed resistance to enslavement. But he is also considered by many to be a person worthy of commemorating in public memory. As you can see from the Denmark Vesey Memorial in Hampton Park in Charleston, South Carolina, that was unveiled in 2014. The monument is the artistic work of Edward Joseph Dwight Jr., who, according to the history makers, is the first African-American to be trained as an astronaut, and the sculptor of many monuments, including the Rosa Parks statue in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I formerly resided. The second religious figure that I focused on is Alexander Cromwell. He is widely known as one of the most important mentors to the African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois. Cromwell was one of the most articulate proponents of African nationalism during the 19th century. In fact, he spent over a decade working as a missionary in Liberia in West Africa, a nation that was originally a colony established by the American Colonization Society for Emancipated African Americans during the age of enslavement in the USA. Cromwell is credited with seeking to uplift African people in the Americas and gradually shifted to an integration of projects that focused on African people located on the African continent before returning to the USA and leading Black Episcopal congregations in Washington, D.C. As you can see, there is a school that commemorates him in public memory. The website for the Alexander Cromwell School indicates that it was, quote, built in 1911 to serve Black children of Ivy City and Trinidad. Those are inner city communities. The Cromwell School was at the heart of community life in Ivy City. And the school was one of the first built in DC for Black children. Designed by DC's first municipal architect, Snowden Ashford, known for his design of the North Hall of Eastern Market and several DC schools, many of which, like Cromwell, are now designated historic landmarks. The third religious figure is the centerpiece of my book and was a colleague of Cromwell in Liberia, particularly at Liberia College. Edward Wilmot Blyton is regarded as a father of African studies, as well as one of the principal architects of African nationalism and Pan-Africanism. He was born in the Danish West Indies, or St. Thomas, in what is now the US Virgin Islands. And he immigrated to West Africa in 1850 at the age of 18 and remained a permanent resident of West Africa until he was almost 80 years of age. The bust of Blyton on Water Street in Freetown, Sierra Leone, was erected at the expense of some of his European admirers in front of City Hall. Travel in the Pan-African Imagination explores the Atlantic world as a productive theater or space where modernity, racialized dominance, and racialized resistance took form. The book stresses the importance of placing 3 Atlantic figures: the Charleston, South Carolina-based armed resistance leader, Denmark Vesey, the West African immigration advocate, Edward Wilmot Blyton, and the Christian missionary and teacher in Liberia, as well as the United States, Alexander Cromwell, within an Atlantic context and as African world community figures between the late 18th and early 20th centuries. The book also examines the religious origins of Black power ideology and modern Pan-Africanism, as products of the intense dialogue within the African world community about concepts of modernity, progress, and civilization. The monograph identifies how travel and social mobility led to the generation of an ever more complex and dynamic African world and of a fluid and adaptive African world community imagination for those figures who were forced to operate within and against a racially framed universe. The vexing social position and symbolic figure of the African was central to the dilemmas facing the racialized imagination of African world community figures and the discipline of Africology. The book is part of an African studies series with Lexington Books, which is an imprint of the Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group. The monograph underwent a doubly anonymous peer review, and an associate editor for African and Middle East Studies at Lexington Books indicated their belief that my work, quote, will make significant and welcome contributions to the fields of African studies, diaspora studies, and literature, among others. While writing the book, I decided that since a major element of my work explores evangelical Christianity and West African Islam, and in light of my inspiration from Kevin O. Sauter, a professor of communications at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, who insisted on the need to engage in what he calls the bold sabbatical, in an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2017. I extended the work that I accomplished during my winter 2019 sabbatical leave by capitalizing on the opportunity to travel to Ghana for 89 days between May and August of 2019. This travel allowed me to continue writing, collecting, and engaging data for my book, and to continue working on a second book project that aims to provide a holistic concept of Africology. In regard to this element of my project, I was able to visit multiple Pan-African historical sites and institutions while traveling and spending time embedded in different regions of the country. I also spent 7 days at the University of Cape Coast as part of strengthening the ongoing international partnership between my former university and the University of Cape Coast. I continue to travel to Northern Ghana in order to work on the second book project, a region that I was honored with the opportunity to meet indigenous leaders, such as the Wunaba, or commonly called the Chief of Wungu, Alhaji Chief Sulemana Isaka. It is fitting that I finished the book while living and lecturing in Ghana at my current position at the University of Environment and Sustainable Development, and that this book launch is taking place under the auspices of the Institute of African Studies, the site where I served as Chief Editorial Assistant for the Women's Health in the City of Accra Research Collective, which is a joint project between the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor and the University of Ghana, Legon, during the summer of 2001, under the auspices of then Deputy Director, Professor Techewa Manu, after completing the first year of my doctoral studies. Indeed, things have come full circle. This is just an image that also gives us a sense of the public commemoration of one of the figures that I studied, in this case, Edward Wilmot Blyton. This image is taken from image I took in 2019 from the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for Pan-African Culture in Accra. Blyton is included among the center's featured images of, quote, eminent African scholars. Among those scholars, Sheikh Anta Diop is also featured. So, in regard to benefit to the Academy and beyond, my book connects with existing curricula in area and global studies, particularly courses in African and African American studies. The book also connects to my second book project in Africology. It is interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, as some people say, as well as transdisciplinary. And it is relevant to other traditional disciplines across the Academy. Community partners that serve and or engage a diverse range of African people will also find my project to be of benefit. I would like to share a section of the introduction to the monograph with you as time permits. Travel and the Pan-African Imagination is a book that has two major objectives, and I'm reading from the introduction. It is an Afrocentric exploration of the Atlantic world as a productive theater or space where racialized modernity, racialized dominance, and racialized resistance took form. I stressed the importance of placing three Atlantic figures within an Atlantic context and as African world community. Framework permits us to focus on process, the ways modern racism was created within the Atlantic by European people faced with difference and seeking to legitimate an exploitative labor system upon which Western prosperity rested. It permits us to understand the ways concepts of civilization, Christianity, modernity, and progress were produced. The African world community perspective permits us to position these three figures between Africa and the West, as talking to minimally three audiences: white Western races, such as Hegel, or people such as Arthur Comte de Gobineau, one of the principal architects of Western racial ideology, fellow African world community figures in the West, and continental African people. This approach, I argue, is different from a traditional diasporic approach that focuses on a dream of Africa, a longing to return to Africa. Conceiving of the Atlantic as transcending national boundaries permits us to reconceptualize the African world community similarly as a space and as experiences that exist outside of, but in intense conversation with both Africa and European people in the Atlantic world. Indeed, as the Africologist Ama Mazama reminds us, she reminds us that, quote, focusing on the imperative need to retrieve and embrace African values and ideas is important. Afrocentricity presents itself as the most potent manifestation of African nationalism today, where Africa also refers to a cultural space. It has also been referred to as African cultural nationalism. Further, according to Mazama, and I'm quoting her here, the Afrocentric idea is a powerful one. Kwame Nkrumah even suggests that it represents the most potent challenge to the European power structure, or what can be called European nationalism, in the last 100 years. The Afrocentric idea rests on the assertion of the primacy of the African experience for African people. Its aim is to give us our African victorious consciousness back. In the process, it also means viewing the European voice as just one among many, but not necessarily the wisest voice. I argue that VC, Cromwell, and Blyton were archetypical African world community figures. I seek new approaches to the study of these three men. Certainly, Blyton is not a US figure, though he is often linked not only to Denmark Vesey and Alexander Cromwell, but also to Martin Robeson Delaney and others specifically US-based Pan-Africanists. Blyton lived most of his life in Africa, but he was a product of the Atlantic, not of Africa. Through Blyton especially, I seek to reposition the origins of modern Pan-Africanism and Black power outside the confines of the geopolitical United States, to reposition it within a refigured African world community or Atlantic space. The second major objective of this monograph is to examine the religious and Victorian origins of Black power and Pan-Africanism as a product of the intense dialogue within the African world community between Western concepts of modernity, progress, and civilization, and the insistence on a rational, progressive, manly Africa. Blyton's Atlantic origins, his rejection of the United States, and his discovery of Africa and Islam through his travel and discursive narratives engage and refute Western travel narratives about Africa. He traveled to Africa, first as a Christian missionary to Liberia, and remained in West Africa. Contrary to his colleague Cromwell, also a Christian missionary and teacher in Liberia, who returned to the United States after living over a decade in Liberia. Vesey was possibly born in West or Central Africa and may have traveled there while enslaved to a sea captain before residing in the United States, before his execution that resulted from his leadership of a plot to engage in armed resistance against American slavery. All three men produced their own versions of history in order to refute Europeans writing fictions about Africa and the African world community. They struggled to answer white Western racist aspirations by representing Africa as a noble continent and as an African people as competent, energetic people worthy of a place in the civilized modern world. The diasporic dilemma of the African world community, which will later become the dilemma of the post-colonial and neo-colonial African intellectual, is how to refute Western denigrations of Africa and African people at the same time as African world community and later post-colonial and neo-colonial African intellectuals embrace Western concepts of civilization, modernity, and progress, concepts that constitute Africa and African people as their negative others. They had to fuse a Western vision of civilization and modernity with an insistence on Africa as both noble and different from the West. This is the conundrum that VC, Cromwell, and Blyton struggled with. It is a source of their conservatism and simultaneously of their radical forms of resistance, including sympathy to Islam and a passionate defense of Africa. In many ways, this is a unique subject of this book, how these men dealt with this conundrum and how their travels in Africa and in the Atlantic world gave them perspectives to become increasingly critical of the Christianizing mission. Through concrete case studies, I explore the 19th century or Victorian era African world community from its origins in the post-revolutionary era through the Victorian and Edwardian era. African world community figures are located precisely at the center of the Atlantic world, in many ways dissociated from both Africa and Western Europe and the United States. The further one goes into the 19th century, the further removed the African world community is from Africa. Africa becomes a mythic place of loss and desire, an object to be missionized by diasporic Christians. Creations of the Atlantic world, of the African world community experience and not of Africa. African world community subjects talk to both the West and to Africa. This is less true of VC than Cromwell and Blyton, of course. This book seeks to map the process of how this occurred and the formation of the resisting subject. Attention to dynamic processes and ongoing changes are considered throughout this study. I explored the balancing act of African world community subjects and how that act changes over time. In the case of the centerpiece of my analysis, I explore how Blyton became increasingly familiar with and at home in Africa. And I'll read a very short section from a subsection of this chapter that is entitled African Power, the Conservative Origins of Black Power Ideology. In his study of Edward Wilmot Blyton and the concept of African personality, the historian M.U. Frankel argued that the title of the newspaper that Blyton played a chief editorial role in publishing in Sierra Leone on April 17, 1872, he argued that the Negro, which was the title of the newspaper, may in a certain sense be regarded as one of the first expressions of Pan-Africanism. Blyton took the word Negro, previously a derogatory term, and made it a symbol of unity. This is how he explained the title of the newspaper. It has been called the Negro, if any explanation is necessary, because it is intended to represent and defend the interests of that particular type of humanity known as the Negro, with all of its affiliated and collective branches, whether on this continent or elsewhere. West African was considered definite enough, but too exclusive for the comprehensive intention entertained by the promoters of the scheme, vis-a-vis to recognize and greet the brotherhood of the race wherever found. It is imperative to note, as the Africologist Malefikete Asante reminds us, that the word Negro did not exist prior to slavery. Both the term and its application were products of the social and economic context of the slave trade. Asante continues, consequently, the attachment of the word Negro to African means a negation of history and culture, unquote. Writing at the context, in the context of Atlantic slavery, Blyton considered the title of the newspaper as being approved by all thinking members of the race in the West Indies and in the United States. There is currently one extant issue of the Negro dated April 16, 1873. An image of the masthead of that particular document appears in the 3rd chapter of my book. To my knowledge, it is the first time that it has appeared in print since the 19th century. I attempted to locate it when I conducted archival research in 2001 at the National Archives in the UK. At that time, it was not accessible to the public. Luckily, the document became accessible in digital form to me during my sabbatical at my former university during 2019. So I was able to get permission to republish it. Oddly, Frankel concludes that, quote, Blyton's claims to it being a Pan-African mouthpiece are therefore symbolic rather than realistic. Though the concept of Pan-Africanism as such was not yet formulated, the underlying ideas were already in the air. I argue that in his capacity as a Pan-African mouthpiece, Blyton formulated the underlying ideas of Black Power ideology. In his standard speech as Liberian Immigration Commissioner, which was titled The Call of Providence to the Descendants of Africa in America, first published in 1862 in one of his first books titled Liberia's Offerings, Addresses, Sermons, etc., Blyton stated, quote, we need some African power, some great center of the race where our physical, pecuniary, which is financial, fiscal, and economic, and intellectual strength may be collected. I argue that while the ideology of Black Power was at best nascent in Blyton's writings, clearly, as early as 1862, Blyton had begun to give voice to his underlying concerns. Blyton was of the conviction that, quote, his, and in this case, he is specifically speaking about the African man's subordinate position everywhere in Christian countries has made him believe that what his foreign teachers think is the only proper thing to think, and that what they say is the only right thing to say. He is therefore untrue to the natural direction of his powers and attempts to soar into an atmosphere not native to his wing. While Blyton was celebrated during the 1960s as a leading African nationalist, today the specific scope, range, and power of his doctrines are not well known. Even in the epicenters of learning and culture, there is not a large appreciation of the African-centered work of Blyton. Indeed, there is very little about the personal life of Blyton that will change the thinking and behavior of African people in the 21st century. He was what Simon Kagandi calls an African Victorian for most of his life as a Presbyterian missionary, though in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he did transform himself into an African, quote, minister of truth. His writing is saturated with conservative Victorian and Edwardian assumptions. Yet Blyton is more than a conventional Victorian figure. He visits Africa, traveling there, observing and writing about his observations, and insisting on a vision of Africa that becomes increasingly critical of Christianity. An exploration of his balancing act and how that act changes over time as he becomes increasingly familiar and at home in Africa reveals the indisputable fact that a scholarly presentation and analysis of the theoretical language of Blytonic prescriptions on the African and racial questions between 1832 and 1912 is of much greater importance than another biographical chronicle of his life. The question of unfolding the African man to himself, the question of the study of the African man from a perspective which reveals his truest nature and idiosyncrasies, the question of informing foreigners of just who and what was an African man were all questions which formed the foundation and of the intellectual production of Blyton. The efforts of African intellectuals and activists to construct an edifice of influence, centers, and practices of productive measures in the interest of African development were a central feature of Black Power politics in the African world community and in Africa during and after its long 19th century emergence. Advocates of what some scholars regard as proto-nationalist immigrationism. I think my time is running short. I will end after 2 paragraphs or 1. Advocates such as the historian Jeffrey O.G. Akbar in his important book entitled Black Power, Radical Politics and African American Identity, he argues that these proto-nationalist immigrationists were the central precursors of the emergence of a coherent, cogent intellectual tradition of Pan-Africanism. Black Power, or the African nationalism, was central to the religious, entrepreneurial, and political strategies of conservative African and African-American intellectuals during the 19th and 20th centuries. Finally, intellectuals like Blyton and Cromwell frequently relied on biblical and Abrahamic scriptural knowledge, ancient and medieval metaphysical conceptualizations of reality designed to conserve Abrahamic religious traditions. This fundamentalist form of conservatism constituted one of the central elements of modern African nationalism and Pan-Africanism. African nationalism or Black power strategies of social activism took place in a variety of institutions and settings, but most especially in churches and schools. And what two institutions have played a more significant role in the conservative organization of Black communities across the Americas and on the African continent than religious institutions and educational structures? I will end with some preaching by Edward Blyton. He preached that, quote, from the lessons that he every day receives, the Negro, and of course he is referring to the African person, unconsciously imbibes the conviction that to be a great man, he must be like the white man. He is not brought up, however he may desire it, to be the companion, the equal, the comrade of the white man, but his imitator, his ape, his parasite. To be himself in a country where everything ridicules him is to be nothing, less, worse than nothing. To be as much like the white man as possible, to copy his outward appearance, his peculiarities, his manners, the arrangement of his toilet. That is the aim of the Christian Negro. That is his aspiration. The only virtues which under such circumstances he develops are, of course, parasitical ones. Every intelligent Negro in the land of his exile must feel that he walks upon the face of God's earth as a physical and moral incongruity. Yet the tools of the Eurasian worlds were considered by modern Pan-Africanists to be open to all human hands. After all, the historical consciousness of Denmark Vesey, Martin Delany, Alexander Crummell, Henry McNeill Turner, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, William H. Ferris, Marcus Garvey, and other 19th and early 20th century African intellectuals revealed an understanding of the interconnections between European civilization and development and its relationship to African enslavement, displacement, colonization, and underdevelopment. These men knew that the economic and social conditions of Africa and the African world community were the direct result of the historical developments associated with European slavery, capitalism, colonialism, industrialism, and imperialisms, developments that were ongoing since the Portuguese first gained a foothold in the gold trade south of the Sahara. I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mankutam. We're so pleased that you chose IAS and this particular forum to launch your book. And I would like to now invite three persons to discuss the book. So for our discussants, we have Mjiba Frehiwot, Mario Nisbett, and Abdul Karim Ibrahim. And they will give their presentations in this order. And I'll introduce each one of them just before they give their presentations. They have 10 minutes, but if they decided to gift us a minute or two to put in the discussion pool, that would be great. So first, Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot, who is a research fellow in the History and Politics section at the Institute of African Studies here at the University of Ghana. Her research and teaching interests primarily focus on Pan-Africanism, decolonizing knowledge production in global Africa, my apologies, air conditioned, dry air, Made in Africa evaluation and the Africa diaspora. Dr. Frehiwot.
Thank you very much, Prof. Anyidoho, as well as Dr. Mankutam. Please, I'm so sorry about mispronouncing your name. I know you as Tracy, so thank you very much, Tracy. So hopefully you all can hear me well. So first of all, I hope everyone will agree. Well, I truly enjoyed reading this text, and I enjoy reading the text for several critical points, and I'm definitely going to try to gift at least maybe 2 minutes, because I think it's important to have a larger conversation with the collective, right? So the first sort of reason why I felt like this text was a particularly groundbreaking text was because the text, while using 3 case studies, the text really provided a blueprint for examining Pan-African intellectual thoughts, right, and thinkers. That's the first thing that I thought, wow, this is a really exciting text. Certainly, you know, we looked at Denmark Vesey and Alexander Cromwell and Edward Blyton as case studies, and we began to sort of weave together their Pan-African contributions and intellectual thought throughout the 20th century. But what I thought was particularly important is couching it under this notion of both an Afrocentric and Africology conceptual framework, theoretical framework, and really through the eyes and this lens. So I thought that that was particularly interesting, because I also noted that this type of an analysis can be done about the contributions of Pan-African figures across space and time using a similar formulation or blueprint, right? And I'm thinking about Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power as an example of this type of work. So that's the first sort of critical point that I thought was interesting. I was actually extremely intrigued by the notion of exploring the Atlantic world as a productive theater or space, right? And I think oftentimes when we talk about the work of, you know, Vesey or Blyton or any of the figures during this period, we often speak about them as one-off contributors to Pan-Africanism, if it happened after 1900 and so-called organized Pan-Africanism, or if it was around, you know, anti-slavery work. But this text really ties their work and their contributions, although in separate spaces, in some cases, separate times, together in this larger Atlantic world, this larger pushback and struggle against imperialism, against slavery and colonialism, and really from a Pan-African perspective, although many did not outwardly say, I'm a Pan-Africanist, but we obviously have to look at the period to determine whether one was identifying themselves openly as a Pan-Africanist during that period. So I think that we have to, I think what's important is when we begin to examine their contributions to Pan-Africanism, we must examine them across space and time. So I think that's a particularly interesting point. Something else that I was like, wow, this is a really interesting concept, and I think that is something that we need to think through in African studies, is Africa referring to a cultural space. And particularly if you look at this notion of Pan-Africanism and how it's practiced on the continent and in the diaspora, really Africa is a cultural space. And Africa being a cultural space can position Africa as the power base that it is, right? As a primary mover, a primary critical moment or critical vehicle in the Pan-African movement, particularly when we begin to view Africa as a cultural space. So I think that that's particularly an important thing that I'm excited about exploring. And then when we're looking at this notion of the work of these 3 great Pan-African intellectuals, right? I'm reminded of the acts of resistance that they participated in as part of the larger internationalism struggle. And I think that when we're telling the story of Pan-Africanism, we cannot tell the story without connecting it to internationalism. So I think that this is a particularly important point. And then another point, oh geez, 5 minutes are already gone. And then another point that I think is particularly important is reconfiguring, right? The reconfiguration of modern Pan-Africanism outside of the US to an African world community, right? I think this is a particularly dynamic and important point. Thinking about an African world community and different geographical spaces being part of that African world community. Another thing that I agree with the author on is delinking the history of Pan-Africanism solely with the United States. I think to link it solely with the United States is an error, and it's also ahistorical. While there certainly were critical moments and critical individuals who contributed to the history of Pan-Africanism in the United States, we can see from this text, Travel and the Pan-African Imagination, that individuals both crossed space and time and interacted with Pan-Africanists, both declared and undeclared Pan-Africanists, right, in different spaces. So I think to link it only to one geographical space is both an error in telling the history, and it limits our understanding of Pan-Africanism. Now, I have a couple of more points which I'll quickly dash to. I don't know where the 7 minutes went. The only challenge, honestly, I have, well, one of the challenges I have with the text, or one of the pushbacks I have is, I noted that this text is talking to white Western racists, fellow African world community members, and continental African people. I'm not sure why a text of this magnitude needs to be having any kind of conversations with white Western racists, or even thinking about white Western racists. I think that is an error often that we make, in that we talk to white Western racists or colonialists or enslavers or whomever when telling our story. One can tell your story without engaging the oppressor. And then three sort of more, well, okay, geez, 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Three sort of more important things that I wanted to say. One, I think the use of religious institutions as sites of resistance is important, right? And it's highlighted, both there's contradictions with Christianity and Islam highlighted in the books, and also how they are sites of resistance. And it reminds me of Nkrumah's triple heritage, right? Arab, Islamic, Euro-Christian, and traditional African heritage, right? One can obviously see the connections between the work of these three great men. And sort of last but not least, I think I want to just note two things. This question of Edward Blyton's return to the continent, right? And I think that this is a really important point in this text, right? As well as Cromwell's sort of 10 years in Liberia. I think it's a very important point in this text because, one, it shows that Edward Blyton and Cromwell and other critical diasporic Africans or Africans in global Africa made this trek or repatriated to their homeland, and it reinforces the fact that African people, for no fault of their own, born outside of the continent, have always had a yearning and desire to come back home, right? And I think it's the forerunner for calls for the diaspora by Nkrumah and other Pan-Africanists to bring the diaspora back home to begin to build Africa, their rightful homeland. And this goes back to, and again, I have given you no seconds, I'm sorry, Prof. And this goes back to Africa as a cultural space, because the other point is that how are people of African descent globally contributing to Africa's development wherever they are? And this text speaks to that. Last but not least, I think it's important to talk about the politics, the politics of imagination and globalism, and how we can begin to situate some of our critical Pan-African intellectuals and thinkers, both from a Pan-African perspective, a global perspective, as well as a new imagination. Thank you very much. And sorry about not giving you a minute.
Thank you, but thank you for keeping exactly to 10 minutes, and also, self-monitoring, so I didn't have to do any work. So thank you, Dr. Frehiwot, and I will move to Dr. Mario Nisbett, who has worked in various capacities with several universities in the US, Jamaica, Kenya, and in Ghana. He's currently a lecturer at the Center for African and International Studies at the University of Cape Coast. His areas of research interest are global African studies, African and African diasporan histories, Pan-Africanism, slavery and resistance. He has publications included in the IAS's own journal, Contemporary Journal of African Studies, and Symbolism. His first manuscript publication is titled The Workings of Diaspora, Jamaican Maroons and Their Claims to Sovereignty. Dr. Nisbett. Your mic is muted.
Thank you for your introduction, Prof. And I'm also thankful for the invitation by the organizers to be a part of this book launch of this. So I'll try not to speak too long myself and try to leave some time for discussion. So Dr. Flemming's texts are Mankutam work. I hope I'm not also destroying your name. Travel and Pan-African Imagination. I thought that work was it was a significant and important work and contribution to the field of African and African diaspora studies and of course Pan-Africanism. And so the work focuses, as we all know, it focuses on the early development of Pan-Africanism. And what I like particularly about the book is that it used these three different figures, but these three different figures and show the significance of travel and how the early development of Pan-African first emerged, but also to the text itself. It's also a very much interdisciplinary text where you have the scholar, theorist, and so the text is really interdisciplinary. It also draws from diverse sources, not only autobiographies, but journals, newspapers, and archival sources. So it really set as foundation, as Dr. Mjiba mentioned, that the work is, shows how Afroology could be used and the significance of it as an interdisciplinary methods of revealing things about the experiences of people of African descent and how their community developed. So one of the most significant thing I thought about the book, the monograph, was how we mentioned the early development of Pan-Africanism as not only in the space of Pan-Africanism was first developed. The idea is often that Pan-Africanism was developed by intellectuals. And so it was the intellectuals that brought about Pan-Africanism. But I like the fact that the author was able to show that Pan-Africanism and the sentiment of Pan-Africanism emerged also among the masses of people and emerged among others besides the intellectuals during this time period. And so in many ways, also to Professor Campbell also talked about Pan-Africanism emerging much earlier. Professor Campbell refers to Pan-Africanism sometime emerging at the dungeons at the very beginning of when Africans decide to unite together to fight against slavery and to bring a broader based community. I think Dr. Flemming's work actually show how that actually was done historically, in terms of providing detail and nuance, look at that aspect of the development of Pan-Africanism. So because of that, it also made me think about like how do we see the development of Pan-Africanism and its origins, and can we have think about the origins of Pan-Africanism perhaps emerging also earlier and in conversations with the development of the Africans' embracement of Christianity and Islam. But Or there are also other times where Africans unite together through traditional African religions. So what was the impact of Islam and Christianity, and also perhaps maybe traditional religions in terms of the development of Pan-Africanism itself, is something I think would be interesting to explore. And if we see this aspect of the conservative part of development of Pan-Africanism, and the question I have to is Pan-Africanism still conservative? And if it is not, do we still, like today in the past, the idea was that to become modern is to become Christian at a certain period of time, is to be Western. And so now today, and how does that impact? What is the overall impact, and is it a deterrent or is it a help to our effort to move towards the ideas of Pan-Africanism and fulfill those goals? I would end with basically saying I thought especially the last part of the book about archaeology, I thought it was interesting in terms of how the discipline is developed and how it's transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. And I think it sets a good foundation for us in terms of us when we look at African history, African culture, how we need to be more disciplinary, transdisciplinary. And I think that Dr. Tracy set a good foundation in terms of how scholars should approach this work. And I will end here and submit my remaining time to further scholars and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nisbett. We appreciate the donation. And finally, we have Mr. Abdul Karim Ibrahim, who is a broadcast journalist and the co-host of the Breakfast Show on Class FM, and a final year MPhil candidate in African Studies here at Legon. He has close to a decade's wealth of experience in media practice in Ghana. His current research interrogates choices and preferences of historically colonized people using the appointment of Black Star coaches as a case study from as far back as 1958 to the present time. It's a perennial issue. In this work, he investigates a possible case of what he calls self-administered prejudice. That's a whole nother conversation, and perhaps we should have you do a seminar on this. I'm sure this is something we're all intensely interested in. But for now, we invite you to comment on the book that we are launching today. Mr. Karim.
Very well, Prof. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and congratulations also to Professor Mankutam for this amazing work. So as is quite evident in my little profile, I am a journalist, and I noticed that there will be quite a good amount of academics, also to speak intellectuals. So I looked at this from the perspective of a journalist. And for me, one of the things that occupied my mind as I read the work was also to try and see how I could analyze this or interrogate this from the perspective of a storyteller, being a journalist. So much of my reflections would be largely based on the element of religion in some of the things that Professor Mankutam talks about in the book. And I say so also because much in the same way as we often are worried about the issue of a disconnect between the academia and industry, I thought that in terms of knowledge creation and the cultural knowledge industry, if I could put it that way, there's also a lot to be done so that when works like this are done, journalists can participate in the promotion of that work and in the discussion of the findings of that work. Because quite unfortunately, for some of us who are on radio all the time, the kinds of things that we hear people say when it comes to issues of Black history, Black identity, Pan-Africanism, and all of that, you can see quite clearly a lack of understanding of what exactly may be going on. And the works of people like Professor Mankutam would be very useful in that regard. So I would hope that he, together with others, would open their minds to also making sure that their works are available to others outside of the space of the academy. And so to focus more on that aspect where I talk about the issue of religion, because I think for many of the other things that are discussed or got my attention, Dr. Frehiwot and Dr. Nisbett have both talked about that. So for me, the book's focus on religion strikes a particularly important chord for African people and historical African reality. And one also struggles to know what to do with Christianity and Islam, perhaps being the most influential or most important cultural institutions on Africa, even up till this point. So the confusion that derives from this, for me, is perhaps very similar to what pertains in the age-long debate in the United States of America about gangs. And gangs like Christianity, like Islam, are just tools. Okay, so some may say that it's up to you to decide what you want to do with them, and that neither of them is good enough to settle the debate as to whether or not we must continue with them. And that's how I see the role of Christianity in a sort of an analysis, and Islam, of course, analysis that Professor Mankutam does. And so reading the book, there are three key issues that stand out for me. I think that it is useful for all of us to understand the origins of modern Pan-Africanism and African nationalism. And also, secondly, the role of Abrahamic faith towards that end. But there's a third part, which, of course, using the three eminent figures that he discusses, I wonder, however, and maybe if Professor Mankutam has an opportunity after this, maybe he would answer. I wonder if this could not be richer with perspectives, works, lives, stories of women. Because when we have heard the stories of the lives of Amy Ashud Gavi and others like that, who have been very impressed with their own stories and the sort of diversity that they bring to conversations like this. So I would be interested in knowing, even though, yes, there's a wide pool of people to choose from and all of that, why there wasn't that element of women and their stories also in here. But to reflect on three key issues that stand out for me. One, and they are like questions also. So if there's an opportunity for others to come in, maybe they would help us to get some answers. So I wonder, because of what relevance really is the Atlantic period in the way that it is discussed to modern contemporary African nationalism. And here, Professor Flemming's analysis of especially Cromwell and also Blyton provide some insights into that. That is to say that it is never enough for the Africa world community to only be interested in the common goal of African people, but that it is also very important to be deliberate about that, deliberate about integration, deliberate about knowledge creation and other things like that. And that is evident in the stories of Blyton and Cromwell, because they weren't just part of the diaspora community, they were part of the African, continental Africa community. And that is also evident in the sort of knowledge that they were able to create and all of that. And I thought that was very important. And I'll be relating these things also to more contemporary things, because as a journalist and as one who interacts a lot with people on social media and all of that, I see a lot of contemporary issues that could be drawn to some of the things that he discusses. And so very recently, the American entertainer Ari Lennox was in Ghana. Steve Harvey, for instance, was also in Ghana. And when they left, the story that they told of Ghana seemed quite representative only of, apart from when they talk about slavery, of course, seemed only representative of a certain class. So they were in Accra, they were in the best of places in Accra, very gentrified parts of Ghana and all of that. And when they put their stories out there, there was a lot of backlash, especially for Ari Lennox. She had to even delete the post that she had made earlier on Ghana and all of that. So I'm wondering, the kind of rift or conflict that exists today, especially from Africans on the continent who have a certain consciousness and think that the contemporary political leadership, doesn't address their interests and all of that, how does one reconcile their perspectives as against the perspectives of Africans who have lived in the diaspora and come here and have a certain relationship, often based on a certain nostalgic, very remorseful feel of the cultural history of Africans? And then secondly, I'm also wondering the place of foreign religions in the continuous decolonization, deconstruction, and reconstruction process for the future of the African world community, as Professor Mankutam talks about. And here, and Prof, you can please anytime come in if my time is up, because I didn't track myself. 1 minute more, that's fine. Yeah, so I wonder also if Christianity and Islam have any role to play at all, and that for people who are contemporary Pan-Africanists, must they not renounce completely the association, their belief in what is regarded as foreign languages, much in the same way that ultimately Blyton, for instance, did. So there are lots more, but these are some of the issues that are on my mind. And I'm very happy, especially for Professor Mankutam, if in further analysis, there will be some attempt to relate the issues with contemporary issues, and particularly for young Africans of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim. So I'll ask Dr. Mankutam to take notes of the issues, the questions that Mr. Ibrahim raised, and any others raised by the other two discussants, while we go to our audience to see whether they also have some thoughts and some comments. You can raise your hand to speak, as a couple of people have done. I also invite you to engage in the chat section. I'm sure that there'll be many more comments and thoughts than we can contain in the 30 minutes or so that we have left. So please use the chat to also talk with each other. Yes, Nana Yao, and then we'll go to Jonathan and then Chichi.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for your...
We can't hear you very well.
Is it better now?
Yes, a little better.
Okay. So, Professor Mankutam, thank you for your presentation. I think one of the things that I would want to mention is how Pan-Africanism is seen as a productive piece for diaspora studies. But I would want to ask if there was any attempt to conceptualize, Atlantic, because I'm thinking your work might probably fall within the same category of Paul Gilroy, and yet Paul Gilroy's work has received a number of backlash from some other scholars like Paul Tiambe-Zaleza. And
we are losing you a bit now. It was very clear, and then halfway through it went Nanaya.
Is it better?
Still faint. What did you do before? It was great.
Is it okay? Is it okay now?
Perfect. Stay right there. Continue.
Okay. All right. So like I was saying, I think this is a very productive exercise, and I thank Professor Mankutam for bringing this work out. But I want to understand if there was any attempt to conceptualize Atlantic, right? Because we know it's a very productive space for the study of diaspora. But then to also concentrate on the Atlantic, as this space that you want to study, the diaspora, also makes his work, in my opinion, fall within the same category of Paul Gilroy. And Paul Gilroy's work has received so much backlash, so much clapback from scholars like Paul Tiambe-Zaleza, who, like Mjiba already had said, claimed that we need to de-Atlanticize, we need to de-Americanize the study of the diaspora. And we also know that scholars like Unoko Rashidi has taken this upon themselves to move beyond studying the diaspora within the area, that we know. So I want to understand if there was any attempt to conceptualize, what the Atlantic stands for, and to address some of these issues that have been raised by some other scholars before moving on to using it as a space for what's the work he's done. And of course, this won't be the first kind of work that has been done, except that the time and space is different. So because readily it brings to mind the work of Kevin Gaines, right? African Americans in Ghana, and Black expatriates in the civil rights era. So I just want to understand if there was any attempt to conceptualize Atlantic and then probably address, I haven't read the whole work, and probably address the issues that come with it before using it as the category of analysis. Again, when I heard the title of the work, Travel and Pan-Africanism, I thought it was going to be within, and I understand, but before I read the synopsis, so I came to understand, I thought it was going to be Travel and Pan-Africanism within the continent. So I understand that it is looking at two geographical areas, right? Travel and Pan-Africanism. But I just want to appreciate if there was any attempt to conceptualize Atlantic before he did. He moved on to doing what he did. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanaya. Jonathan.
Right. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Mankutam. I have not, I look forward to getting the book and reading it, but I have a quick question. It has to do with Blyton's support for colonization. As somebody who is not deeply following historical readings and so on, and also in a moment when we are talking about decolonization, once in a while when we come across this historical document and you seem to, it seemed to suggest that Blyton at some point was supporting colonization, then it gets one worried. How should we understand his support for colonization in that historical context, as well as others?
All right, thank you. And Titi.
Very sorry about that. I know that your focus, thank you very much, Professor Mankutam. I know your focus is very much Ghana, but I'm interested in knowing about Afro-Caribbean influences. People like Edward Glisson and Derek Walcott. What would they add to your analysis if you were to take them? And I wanted to kind of challenge your view about parasitic relationship that Africa has with the West. I actually want to say, is it not symbiotic in the sense that the West eats from Africa and vice versa, and sometimes one benefits, the other doesn't, or neither benefits? So is it not rather mimetic? Is it not rather symbiotic instead of parasitic? And then that issue of imitation, I also think that it's actually mimesis and rivalry, and not necessarily copycatting, but actually re-representing. I'm sorry, I've got this thing about words and definitions. And then with that, I wanted to ask, what about the issue of identity theft and Africa taking on that stereotype of the thief and being actually more powerful than the West in certain ways because they're taking back, and that's subversive? And lastly, what do you think about the idea of syncretism? I know you're talking about Christianity and Muslim, but you find that in many countries like Fulani culture in Senegal, they actually mix it and they have their own African traditional religion, where you find that sometimes the shaman or the medicine man is actually more powerful than the minister. Or sometimes you might find that the praise poet, the bard, is even more powerful than the minister. So what do you think of that dynamic? And I'm sure it actually works as well in a lot of West African countries, maybe even Ghana. I'm not so knowledgeable about Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to give Dr. Mankutam, let's say 5 minutes or 6 minutes. I know this is not a lot of time to try to respond to those that you feel that you do want to respond to. Some of were comments, so you don't need to feel pressure to have to answer those. Dr. Mankutam, over to you.
Thank you very much for the excellent engagement with the presentation, and I look forward to ongoing engagements. I'd first like to start by perhaps been a bit autobiographical. The name Mankutam is a Mamprusi name in the Mampruli language. It means I will never forget. I have been integrated into the kingdom of Mamprugu over the course of about a decade now, and I recently had a naming ceremony in Wungu, which is a part of the West Mamprusi district in northern Ghana, which is close to Burkina Faso. That provides a window to answering, responding to some of the questions. In regard to the issue of Atlantic, I was far more influenced by the work of Joseph Roach and his work on circumatlantic performance. I was very interested in his assessment of carnival and performance and how it helps us understand the syncretic nature of different African communities, whether it's in New Orleans or whether it's in Dakar. In regards to Blyton's support of colonization, that is one of the most conservative elements of his Pan-Africanism. Blyton was an advocate of colonization as a means of achieving what we call political independence today. I was very interested in helping to bring home the point that the origins of Pan-Africanism and modern African nationalism were conservative is because they are usually inherently associated with their more contemporary variants that are Marxist-Leninists and now confined to the academy through post-structuralist movements. In regard to Afro-Caribbean influences and different critical theories approach, I was a former student of Mamadou Diouf from Senegal, as well as Carol Smith Rosenberg. And it was through them that I began to think of these issues through the lens of critical theory. But I always found them to be so contemporary that if Blyton is arguing that the Christian and Muslim takes on parasitical qualities in their adoption of foreign religions, the reaction is usually presentist. So I think that that is certainly an issue I have to continue to work on, and it's something that I want to work on in my second book on a holistic concept of Africology. So that is a very much appreciated intervention. Identity theft also is one that I've been wrestling with via Cromwell. Cromwell argued that African people should become what he called, quote, cosmopolitan thieves, that they just seize upon the best of traditions from a global perspective in the quest for the total liberation of all African people. I think I partially addressed the questions from the audience. I wanted to speak a bit about the issue of women and why I chose to focus on men. I think the studies of masculinity and the formation of the national subject are very important. They're usually left out of analysis where we usually ignore, for instance, that the founding slaveholding fathers of the United States created what they called an American subject that was very much exclusionary of women, the indigenous population, and African people. It was a subject that was almost coded as being inherently a white male. The book, This Violent Empire, by Carol Smith Rosenberg is one of the best assessments of the role of masculinity in nationalist formation. So as I read the primary sources about African nationalism, Pan-Africanism, the masculinist threat was always there, but rarely interrogated. And it was through taking courses in women's studies as well as gender studies that I decided that it was important to put these ideas on the table and to interrogate them in a protracted analysis. The quote from Cosmopolitan Thieves, I think it's, I'm looking at the chat. I think it's from, I could be wrong. I think it's from his article on civilization as an indispensable to African development, something along those lines. But if you, I can take note of your email and send it directly to you, Dr. Gillis, with no problem. the story of why including white Western races and telling the story, telling our story without engaging the oppressor. That is a part of my next project, in the sense of providing a holistic concept of Africology that starts with antiquity. I think it's important, as Dr. Frehiwot suggested, that we need not utilize white Western races whom are as the catalyst for our studies of resistance to, in this case, white supremacy. I would like to leave a few more minutes for others to speak.
Yes, actually, we have basically run. Chichi, is this going to be really short, like 15 seconds worth?
Yes. I just wanted to say, with the mummy water, you talked about initiation ceremonies and rites. What about the cosmological, the mythological aspect? Did that empower Africans? And the idea of religion spreading, traveling across the Atlantic, where you have different versions of mummy water in Haitian voodoo and Benin, even down in Southern Africa.
Okay, and I see another hand popped up. Okay, I'm going to be very, very generous. Really, really quickly, Professor Canterbury.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Professor Mankutam, for such a wonderful work. And I was wondering whether the work is even more than a contribution to African studies, and whether it's not a contribution to the study of the theory and knowledge about the expansion of capitalism. I say this because it would seem to me that Pan-Africanism is a product of the expansion of capitalism. And so I was wondering as well, if you care to comment on that, as well as the fact that this other point that was raised about Biden's support for the American Colonization Society, and whether there is any sort of similarities with a far stretch with Garvey's conversation with the Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan. Thank you.
Okay. Can you respond in a minute?
Yes, I quickly would say that the expansion of capitalism is inherently tied to the emergence of what we call modern Pan-Africanism. Although Pan-Africanism's origins are certainly not in modernity. There are scholars now who argue for the origins of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism have to be considered in classical African civilizations. The first instance being the unification of Upper and Lower Kemet, or what we call ancient Egypt. I think that the parallels between Blyton's support of the slaveholding funded ACS and Garvey's engagement with the Ku Klux Klan are certainly, there's certainly an overlap. That is a part of the conservative elements, I think, that also have to be taken in consideration when we think about the origins of Pan-Africanism, modern Pan-Africanism.
And any comments on Titi's comments to question?
Well, I didn't mention Mami Wata, but I like the analysis because it was in Northern Ghana that I had personal engagement with practitioners. And in the Eastern region here in in the Eastern region of Ghana, where I'm currently living, it's prevalent. So just yesterday, for instance, I rode my moto to Akua C in doing preliminary visits to indigenous sites that we usually call them shrines of spirituality, in order to engage them. But that is something that I would like to explore in the second second monograph. So I will be in touch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mankutam, for writing this book and for making the time to come talk with us about it. Thank you to our three discussants, Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot, Dr. Mario Nisbett, and Mr. Abdul Karim Ibrahim. And thanks to everybody who made the time to join us today. I would hand over now to our host, Dr. Chika for any announcements that he might have.
Thank you so much, distinguished chair, for thanking everyone. Once again, we are grateful that in spite of the actual breakout, a pandemic of online events, you make time to join us another Institute of African Studies seminar series event. We are most grateful and look forward to meeting you again next week for another interesting event. And like we heard during the course of this meeting, one of the discussants, Mario Nisbett, has a new book out on Jamaica Maroons, and we'll be also planning to bring that to the notice of the Reading Academy, in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for your time, and do enjoy the rest of your day. And if you would like to unmute and say hi to anyone or to all of us here, show you a video, anything, so that it's all welcome for another 1 minute. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Mba, I asked if the books are available here. Didn't get an answer. I put it in the chat.
Oh, Dr. Mankutam, that should be a question for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I am currently in the process of trying to work out some arrangements with a local publisher who has published internationally published texts in Ghana. I think it's video books in Accra. They print them in India. At present, you can certainly order it and have them delivered to Ghana. I've done that. And that was cumbersome, but an adventure. Ended up taking me to CODESRIA after being asked to come to Accra. But I really would like the book to be available locally at a rate that is affordable and not a Western or American price. So that is in the works. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Mankutam, you did say that there is a possibility of people buying at a discounted rate. We had shared that information in the very last announcement we made. If someone wants to buy a hard copy from outside the country.
Yes, that information can be found on the publisher's website. I also disseminated a discount flyer that they provide, but I can also provide that to you as well. But it's accessible through various entities, from Amazon to the independent booksellers as well.
Thank you, Dr. Mankutam.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We will be ending the meeting in a second.